Basic white tea. Pair of jeans. Boohoo delivery.
Consumer items. Clothes, gadgets, food, furniture. Each of them have a history. And that history has a specific shape, sociological, economic, cultural, that determines the effect that that item then has on us and the world. That is, consumer items aren't just shallow, not just worn or consumed, but have a depth. It's only when we take the time to understand that depth that we really understand them.
Virginia Woolf wrote that vain trifles as they seem, clothes change our view of the world and the world's view of us.
So, do our clothes tell a story? What stories do you surround yourself with?
The historian Frank Trentman says that as an article of consumption, clothing is uniquely sensitive. There is no other thing which has such a tactile and visual presence in our lives. We touch it, see it, feel it. The clothes we wear contribute to our sense of our bodies. The line between us and the thing is therefore a fuzzy one. One recent philosopher has even generously accorded clothes a kind of half-life, since they move with our bodies. We live our clothes as though they were alive. Your trousers do the walking.
When we think of consumerism, which I looked at in depth in the last video, fast fashion is probably one of the most common things that comes to mind. For some, fast fashion has democratized the fashion industry, bringing style to the masses affordably, something I need. To others, it's a symbol of environmental degradation, waste, low wages, child labour, and even death. The fact is that between 2000 and 2014, the number of clothes produced worldwide has doubled to 100 billion items a year. Okay, I have a pair of jeans, a top from H&M, and a Boohoo delivery, which is a fast fashion brand here in the UK. I'm not sure if you have it in America or not. Either way, let's start with the jeans.
According to this great book by Dana Thomas, at any one time, half the world is wearing jeans. If you're American, the odds are you have 7 pairs. Jeans were invented in the USA and for the American market, manufactured there domestically for years. They were the centre of the US apparel industry. German-American businessman Levi Strauss patented Levi's in San Francisco in 1873. The denim came from a mill in New Hampshire, and they were sewed by 50 seamstresses in San Francisco. Levi's weren't cheap, but they were durable, patchable, tough. They'd last. Strauss expanded and quickly became one of the richest men in California.
For over a century, Levi's, the company, was known for its conscience. As late as the 1970s, an ethicist was employed to advise on responsible business practices. They frequently gave to charities and communities in the local areas they operated in. They refused to enter the South African market under apartheid, and they pulled out of Indonesia because of corruption.
But as competition expanded and the times changed, customers started moving on to new brands. Levi's lost its cool factor. In 1993, America, Mexico and Canada signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, eliminating tariffs on most imports and exports between those countries. American companies quickly started manufacturing in Mexico where labour costs were cheaper. In 1997, Levi's announced they'd be closing 14 factories. They weren't going abroad, they insisted. It was just that labour costs were too high to keep producing, competition too fierce. But sales continued to fall, and slowly it went from designing and manufacturing and marketing everything in-house to outsourcing everything except design. The original factory closed its doors in 2003. Others around the countries quickly closed too. Today, Levi's are made in places like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Pakistan.
Now, jeans used to be really hard, like solid when you bought them. You really had to wear them in and wash them to get them down to the right size for you. They were like flat as a pancake. But in the 1980s, stonewashing was invented. At the end of production, jeans went into this huge tumble dryer, this washer with huge stones to be finished and distressed, how we see them today.
Now, most jeans are finished in Vietnam. Thomas writes that traditionally, finishing a pair of jeans requires an average of 70 litres or 18 gallons of water, 1.5 kilowatts of energy and 150 grams or 5 ounces of chemicals. In total, that equals an astonishing 350 million cubic litres, 92 million gallons of water, 7.5 billion kilowatts of energy, enough to power the city of Munich for a year, and 750,000 tons of chemicals each year ad nauseum. Jeans are usually made of cotton, one of the most polluting crops in the world. Cotton production uses 10% of the world's pesticides use. 8 out of 10 of the most popular pesticides are classed as hazardous by the World Health Organization. And it takes 10,000 litres of water to grow 1 kilogram of cotton and 2,700 litres to produce one single cotton t-shirt. In Guangdong, China, the jeans capital of the world, 800,000 pairs of jeans are produced every single day. The dye that goes into jeans are made of chemicals like petroleum, cyanide and formaldehyde, which are all toxic to humans and the wider environment, and the Pearl River, which the factories sit on, has probably become one of the most polluted in East Asia.
Okay, what about Boohoo? Boohoo is a central pillar of the fast fashion trend here in the UK. If you look on their website, there are literally thousands of designs, always changing. I mean, because I'm very dull, I ordered a black t-shirt and a black vest. Together they cost around $15 and they've arrived the next day.
Here's what happens. Fast fashion scouts visit the top fashion shows in places like Paris and London. They post photos and videos on social media, see which ones get the most likes, steal the designs, reinterpret them slightly, and immediately begin to manufacture them in small batches. In the US clothing industry, manufacturing used to be centred in Manhattan, but in the 1950s, companies began moving outwards to the suburbs and then out of state to find cheap labour. By the 70s, when policies like NAFTA were beginning to be explored across the globe, Hong Kong had become the world's largest exporter of cheap Western clothes. In the 80s, clothing companies became interested in a concept called quick response. The problem was that it took over a year from design to orders being placed to clothes arriving in store. Fashion trends in our consumer society, though, were changing much quicker than that.
QR was about agility, speed, responding to consumer demand and having a network of supply chain partners that could be responsive.
In Spain, fashion executive Amancio Ortega wondered how he could apply quick response to his small company, Zara. He wanted to go beyond the industry standard seasonal collections. This shouldn't be fast fashion, he said. It should be instant fashion. Traditional sales cycles took 6 months. Ortega thought he could get it down to 6 weeks. If a style doesn't sell out in its first week, it should be cancelled. Now, Zara gets through around 24 collections a year and can get from design to store in 2 weeks. Ortega moved production from Spain to Morocco to reduce labour costs. By 2001, Zara had over 500 stores across the world. In 2018, there were 2,200.
Other companies, Gap, Urban Outfitters and H&M all followed suit. The key to QR is subcontracting and outsourcing as much as possible so that production lines can be dropped and changed and adapted quickly.
To take just the US, in the 70s, at least 70% of clothing was manufactured domestically. By the late 80s, fast fashion began to change this. In 91, it was down to 56%. In 2012, down to 2.5%. And between 1990 and 2012, 1 million jobs were lost. Thomas writes that fabric would be woven and dyed in one locale, cut in another, sewed in a third, with zippers and buttons attached in a fourth, and finishing touches, denim dressing, embroidery, were executed in yet another land. Nearly every step was, and is, contracted or subcontracted. Few fashion companies own their own factories. Bangladesh is the cheapest place in the world to manufacture clothes. In 2019, tens of thousands of workers went on strike against low wages. The industry in Bangladesh is notorious for cutting health and safety corners to keep down costs. In 2005, a Spectrum Sweater Industries factory collapsed, killing 64 and wounding 80 more. In 2010, just after an inspection by Gap, a factory in the capital, Dhaka, caught fire. 29 died, 100 were injured. Between 2006 and 2012, more than 500 died in factory fires. After these fires, brands, NGOs and unions worked on the Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety Agreement. It was left unsigned and forgotten by almost every big clothing company. Another fire in 2012 broke out in a building that supplied Disney, Sears and Walmart. Emergency exits were padlocked to prevent theft. 117 died, 200 were injured. And in 2013, the Rana Plaza building collapsed in Dhaka. 1,134 died, 2,500 were injured. One of the more interesting phenomenon with fast fashion is that companies have a vested interest in reshoring manufacturing so as to speed up the time it takes to literally deliver the clothes from factory to shelf. Boohoo manufactures in the centre of the UK in Leicester. In 2020, The Times reported that workers were paid below minimum wage, way below £3.50, and worked in poor conditions.
As the story developed, it was discovered that Boohoo had really poor records of who was supplying them at all, as subcontractors were subcontracting other subcontractors, and claims that Boohoo monitored the whole subcontracting process turned out to be completely untrue.
In the Levitt report commissioned by Boohoo in the aftermath, Alison Levitt wrote, "Boohoo has simply no idea where its clothes are being made and thus has no chance of monitoring the conditions of the workers who make them." She adds, "They did not know and did not really care." And as Steve New writes, perhaps the most telling conclusion about the role of civil society that emerges from the Boohoo story is unequivocal proof that the glossy statements made by the firm about their scrutiny of the supply base were unreliable.
The problem is the system's complexity. It's an economic system that's full of holes in accountability, ignorance by choice, selective supervision and regulation, driven by a race to the bottom in low wages.
The pressure to produce as cheaply as possible while threatening to change supplier means that suppliers do everything they can to push down wages and not pay overtime, which in turn forces subcontractors to cut corners, sidestep regulation, and manufacture in cheap and unsafe buildings.
In one study in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza disaster, researchers collaborated with a supply chain company to look at 32,000 orders that went to subcontractors that weren't on the company's authorised suppliers list, which would then go on to be more likely to avoid scrutiny and be more likely to use unsafe buildings and pay poor wages in poor working conditions and so on. More than a third of those 32,000 orders ended up going to unauthorised suppliers.
Another study found that price pressure, asking for lower prices for return orders, made it more likely that a manufacturer would use an unauthorised supplier. The cheaper the product, the more frequently it happens. Professor in human trafficking and modern slavery, Martin Boersma, writes that global supply chains link us all to the shame of child and forced labour. We have what philosophers have called a value-action gap, where our actions and values may not coincide. We may want to protect the environment but not have the resources to buy more expensive ethical products. We may not have the time to look into every product we buy. We may think it does no good anyway. Terry Hathaway at the London School of Economics writes that even the most hyper-vigilant, well-informed shopper cannot know everything. Which is the point of regulation, the point of politics. A proposed fashion act in New York would require companies to report on and implement due diligence across its supply chain. And those building fires in Bangladesh, they're the result of a political decision. The result of a change in our socio-economic circumstances. They're the result of the neoliberal revolution. They're the result of policy choices which we can change.
Take H&M, who admittedly I've used a lot. I buy their plain t-shirts, they're cheap and they fit me well. They use 800 suppliers worldwide. Since the pressure placed on them in the wake of Rana Plaza, many, including H&M, have published their suppliers list. Let's take a quick look at that list. So all you have to do is Google H&M suppliers list. They publish it on their website. Cambodia, Romania, China, Bangladesh. I'd say about 80% of these are Bangladesh. But they publish their address, the name, the supplier name, the factory address. Now I just said that they use 800 suppliers. They've listed here almost 2,000. Spent about half an hour Googling a few. Utah Fashions Limited. And then I came across this report, Factory Safety in the Garment Sector. An assessment of mandatory human rights due diligence obligations with apparel brands. This is from 2021. And Utah Knitting and Dyeing Ltd. No sprinkler system and no fire alarm system. The fire systems, worker safety, the condition of factories in Bangladesh is, as we've seen, the most important part of this. And even though the companies have promised transparency and are providing a level of transparency, from 2 minutes of digging, you can see that there are huge holes in it. And who's looking over this? There's just too much to pour over. So the only way to enforce this is to regulate so that companies are responsible for what goes on in their supply chains. Who's looking through all this? This research has been pretty insightful for me. What stories do your clothes tell?
Thank you as always for watching. And a huge thanks, of course, as always, to my Patreons, without which this just wouldn't be possible. So if you want to see scripts, if you want to chat in the Discord server, if you want your name in the credits, but most of all, if you just want to help support, make this content, then click the link in the description below. If not, you can like, you can share, you can leave a comment, all those things that help the algorithm. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.